Big ideas start with a spark. At Tassi's, we use that spark to ignite the fire in ourselves and our kids. So with the trust we build and the knowledge we share, we can grow together and stand tall, creating opportunities to advance in business while setting an example for the next generation. Whether you are starting fresh in Portugal or expanding globally, we're here to support each other. This is more than a network. We are a community that sets the examples for the leaders of tomorrow.
Okay, so let's start from the beginning. You've worked in a lot of different brands, obviously Nike and Chanel. How has that shaped the way that you approach building your own companies, obviously?
I think that's a good question, and I've intentionally chosen throughout my career different types of organizations to build my skills, and I think that's even more relevant these days than it was back then. There's certain threads that run through in terms of my experience from brand building and from building engaged communities, thinking about content, community, and commerce. And I think I intentionally sought out large companies, particularly, you don't get any better than Nike in terms of marketing. Don't really get any better in terms of luxury than Chanel. But I'd never made product and I hadn't done an MBA. So when I saw an opportunity in the market to make CBD tinctures, I then went into that. I found some female investors. I was in Oregon at the time. And I saw the opportunity to really make products. It was one of the most humbling experiences I've ever had. But I knew there was a gap in the market, which obviously is where the majority of founders need to start. You have to listen to the voice of the consumer and identify what the opportunity is.
And how did your personal connection, with using CBD during chemotherapy and your whole journey with that, how did that personal angle change how you viewed the customer experience for the company?
I think that's a really good question, and I think the experience with it made me realize that the current healthcare system needed to be challenged. And that was 10 years ago. Since then, we've seen a huge amount of innovation in healthcare and a lot of disruption in healthcare as well. My personal experience, I think, actually led me to a place, and I talk about this in terms of the product, but also in terms of professionally and personally in building a team, to a place that I really wanted to instill some personal values that resonated with me. And I think we talk quite a lot in the brand world about corporate products, but it's really important for me, and I talk about this a lot when I'm mentoring. It's about your brand and your personal brand as well. And what I found over the years that the best work comes from when you can align your personal brand and your purpose, your values, with that of an organization or that of a startup mission, for example. And that gives you really sharp point and clarity of vision that you can then really engage and empower and inspire your team to go after.
And there can sometimes be a bit of a negative stimuli around the idea of CBD, but you managed to pivot that and change it to this luxury, amazing company for women. How were you intentional about making that shift and being very clear in the branding and the marketing for that company?
I think it's an interesting question, and I think it's interesting because when there are frontiers, whether it's in product or service even, and that often happens, and it was a little bit the Wild West, right? But it often happens in areas that are not necessarily legalized currently, or there's been a variety of different activities in that space. Look at psychedelics, for example, in healthcare now. I think for me, it was a case of seeing in a clinical context through my breast cancer and with my oncologist's agreement and in, sign off, that it worked not just for me, but for other patients out there. And I think I had a very strong belief in being able to challenge and be curious and think about the Western medicine proposition that was being served up to me, and also be a little bit cynical about, okay, well, this is amazing, but by the time I found my lump, I was stage 3, triple negative, so very aggressive. So I had a very limited number of options really open to me. But my curiosity led me to question everything I was doing. And that's kind of paved the way for my approach now when I look at companies and startups to invest in, and I see gaps in the market. So I've just invested in an amazing organization based in Portugal called the After Cancer, and they're really targeting patients post-cancer across the range. So I think it's that combination of professional and personal, and if you can show up at work as your full self and your authentic self, and you can really combine what you're doing in a space that you care about. Think about ikigai, of course, the Japanese concept of what does the world need and what can you bring. Then you can really solve problems that have a positive impact.
And you talked a little bit about meeting with investors, investing in companies. When you're meeting with a founder, what's one signal or one thing that you're looking for to tell you that they're the one to bet on?
Founders can be, well, there are a certain breed and a certain type. And when you meet a lot of founders, you realize that there has to be that congruence, that merging of mission and that clarity of vision. That's not to say that that's necessarily going to get them everywhere or the full distance. I think there's definitely an element of self-awareness that founders need, and that's often what teams like Carbon, my team with Carbon Holdings, that's what we do. We coach and advise founders, because it's very rare to get a founder, particularly when you're looking for early stage founders, and we're very keen to work with young founders who are digital natives, who are using AI to really advance and innovate. It's very rare that those founders are the full package. But what we can try and do is work with them to say, okay, well, these really are your skill set. Let's help you bring on board people to round out the team and be successful that way.
And obviously as well, your recent company, ThermoCheck, is an amazing company. It's helped so many women around the world. But how it's a difficult kind of technology to educate people about, because a lot of people might not be aware of the technology or aware that this is such an issue. And because it's preventative, it can be difficult because you can't show the clear outcome. How are you integrating that within your marketing and being conscious of that idea?
I think it's a good question. I think a lot of people in health, in the world of health, wellness, longevity, struggle with certain topics. And I think I've been surprised, I would say, and I talk about breast cancer all the time, very openly. And I've written a book about it, of course, and it's my mission to really, and I feel very privileged and honored to be able to mentor and coach women and men going through a cancer experience. But it's very personal and it's very individual. And that means it's not always a very easy conversation to have and a communication narrative to put into the world. But I think you have to really go back to what does the consumer need, what at different types of the journey, different stages of the journey, right? And that's what businesses and companies in this space do really well. I think when going back to ThermoCheck, it's really what I see in terms of the world at the moment and the healthcare system, particularly shifting to much more towards preventative. And owning your own data, knowing your benchmarks, and being able to actually have the power and the tools at your disposal in order to make changes. So I think had I had a mammogram a year before I found my own lump, had I known my markers, my blood markers, my biomarkers, had I done my DNA test back then that I have now, then I would have that longitudinal data to be able to have a read. If I'd been wearing my Oura ring and I'd had that data as well, there would be early warning signs, because a lot of this is inflammation at the earliest stage. So thermography and ThermoCheck sees inflammation in the breast tissue. But yes, it can be a challenge to communicate the benefits, of course. But I always say that it's better to know and being able to do something about it.
And how has your own personal journey, obviously with breast cancer, shaped these companies? Because I think that a lot of people are in these industries maybe don't have as much personal ties to it, and they aren't able to view the customers in the same way that you probably are. How do you think that's shaped your trajectory?
I think it's an interesting one. From an investment point of view, people tend to invest in areas they feel very passionate about. So that means you can be very selective about who you have the conversations with at what point. We need to invest, as you know, I'm sure, more in women's healthcare generally and in innovation in the space. And that starts with diagnostics and testing, and also starts with trials, of course, specific for women. It's shaped my perspective in terms of my passion for this space. Nike really was where I learned about innovation, product, service, and brand experience. And then being able to apply those lessons in a different context is really what gets me excited. Being a catalyst for growth and change. So.
And the idea of growth and change, you've like worked at a couple of different companies, not countries.
And in different
And in
countries.
different countries too. Obviously at Chanel and then Nike, you moved up through a lot of different positions there, and then Love and then Thermocheck. How do you know when it's the right time to leave a company? Like, you know, Love got acquired and then time to leave Nike. When do you know that that's the moment that's right for you?
That's a really interesting question, and I think it's important. It's one that more people, more younger people, have to ask themselves more often, because the world of work has changed so much. You know, even when I was young, there was not going to be a job for life. And so for me, it's about how do you work out what you can give and where you want your skills to evolve. How can you remain curious and keep that pace of learning and growth? And if you are entrepreneurial, you can seek out places within an organization that are entrepreneurial, like I did with Nike with influencer marketing and sort of 1 + 1 = 3 in terms of expanding the edges of the brand through design collaborations with people like Riccardo Tisci, Zaha Hadid, et cetera. We're all these sort of bringing that expansive approach to the company you're with. And then I think, you know, there's different ways these days. I don't know many younger people that don't have a side hustle, that aren't a polymath, that aren't, you know, having these conversations in multiple areas. But ultimately, I think if you have that essence of a sense of who you are and what you can give, then I think you can remain true to yourself and thread that through your career trajectory.
And you talked a bit about influencer marketing, obviously, which you brought in Chanel, and then you brought in at Nike as well. At the time, that's quite a new approach to marketing. Now it's like very well known, but you were betting on something that probably a lot of people wouldn't have been aware of at the time. Yeah. What made you so convinced that that was the way to go? And then now, what are you looking at that people maybe aren't betting on in the marketing and branding world, but that you think is going to be big next?
It's so important that there's been so much change and shift through that process. Yes, you know, Chanel and luxury know their customers. They know them one-to-one. They obviously know 20% that power 80% of their revenue. And they've always been exceptionally good at bringing the customer, the client, on a journey with them. A friend of mine was just at the couture show with Chanel last week. And she is an incredible woman, and she does an incredible job as a brand ambassador for Chanel. She's what you would call a micro-influencer, incredibly well connected in LA. Yeah. And so, yes, we've definitely seen a shift. You know, when we were setting up influencer marketing at Nike, it was about broadening the edges of the brand and understanding that the customer, the consumer, could be and should be a fan of Nike both on and off the court. Yeah. And, you know, a LeBron or a Serena are amazing and incredibly aspirational. But what we did when we listened to the voice of the consumer is really find that not everyone felt they could ever be as good as Serena. Yeah. And so it was important to say, okay, well, let's broaden the aperture, widen the aperture of the brand. Let's engage with personal trainers who are at Equinox or at Boutique Fitness, and then have that day-to-day interaction with consumers and engage with the conversation in a different way. And of course, you know, the consumer is your brand. They are your billboards. They have your billboard on their phone. So it's really a case of having that ongoing flywheel and continuous conversation with the consumer and listening, learning, listening and responding and really respecting what they bring to your brand. Because I think we ignore Gen Z at our peril. Yeah. And so that's a really important shift in terms of brands.
Was there a lot of obstacles or hurdles you had to overcome trying to implement that program? Because I imagine a lot of people wouldn't know about it, or it would be
internally and Nike, absolutely. So it was a huge shift. We worked very closely with John Slusher and the sports marketing team, who had all the contracts for LeBron and Travis Scott, etc. With LeBron, they had never talked about or thought about signing someone like Travis Scott before. And so it took a lot of convincing and a lot of time, and we had to ring fence some of the other investments that non-athletes had with the brand, convince internally that someone like Travis, someone like Kendrick Lamar do a ton of working out off the stage, and Beyonce, so that they can perform on the stage. We never ended up signing Beyonce, but we talked about it a lot internally, and my kids thought I was cool at that point. And so it's really about how can you talk to a consumer and meet the consumer where they are in a cultural context that resonates. And so, yes, it was interesting. We took some of the team from Nike and their kids to a Drake concert.
Amazing.
And that's when they understood really
Right.
this is the guy who can be appeal.
When you're trying to create those relationships and then establish, maintain them, how are you balancing innovation, obviously wanting to create new programs with then balancing the traditional customers and the traditional relationships that you have within a company?
Always you're talking really to the game changers and the innovators in to start with, that sharp point. And that's obviously that influences how you form the narrative and who you collaborate with. So really it's those game changers in society, those people who are innovating across different verticals of influence, whether it's design, whether it's sports, whether it's food, it's a whole fashion, a whole range. And it's about having that diversified portfolio so that, and being super intentional about how you roll out products and how you launch innovations and to which market. So for example, Nike's a great example, of course. It's the playbook, Nike playbook. But we were very sharp on innovation and innovating for athletes. So listening to the voice of the athlete, talking to someone like Mo Farah, and saying, what shoes do you like? And that itself, that conversation, and what do you need on the track to win?
Right.
And that conversation then drives the product innovation to say, okay, let's design Flyknit. It's light, it's sustainable, it's form-fitting, and it's fast. Key attributes of the product. But also it's solving for the bigger business context and the bigger business problem, which is how do we retain the IP of the products we're producing, and how therefore can we bring it onshore, nearshore, and create manufacture in the US in this case, and be closer to the consumer in terms of manufacturing and retain that IP. So it solves the best collaborations, solving multiple problems for the business at the same time. And then you're making these amazing spikes that are on Mo's feet in 2012, and then he wins a double-double. But what we did intentionally was make sure that we trickle that innovation down through the product portfolio.
Right.
So it appeared across, and the same colorway, the month later, across different footwear lines. But it's really that coordination of product launch and brand moment. So it's the right products on the right person at the right time that powers the brand forward.
And in Nike, obviously, that's a company that's very known for its innovation, maybe a little bit easier. How was it in Chanel? Because out of all the luxury companies, Chanel is very innovative. But we're looking at like Burberry now, they're kind of struggling between that old luxury and those traditional customers and then the new British people that they want to bring in and have products for them. How did you balance that, Chanel?
Well, with Chanel, we always knew that a certain demographic and a mass market consumer would come in for a lipstick.
Yeah.
But and because you were able to buy into the brand, you were able to own a piece of Chanel in the story. There's definitely an element of obviously exclusivity, but also craft. The signatures of luxury are obviously craft and quality in terms of materials, of course, and the legacy of the brand. So it is a balance between being true and retaining that DNA of the brand in storytelling, but also evolving and modernizing. And some of that can come through in terms of the way you tell the story, in terms of the way you reach new consumers. Could be new markets, could be new lines, could be makeup, for example, for Hermes, hugely profitable, amazing margins, but it also gives a wider sports,
audience,
even, for some of these luxury brands. What we saw was some of the designers, Virgil Abloh is a great example. He learned with Nike how to make sneakers and then went to LVMH and made sneakers. So it's an interesting dynamic within the market.
I was going to say as well, like, how does that branding and working with Nike for so long and with Chanel, obviously, how does that change the way that you looked at growing your own companies and starting your own companies?
Yeah, it changes the way you think about how, actually with Nike and a little bit with Chanel as well, how important brands are culturally. And I think we see at the moment, we've seen over the past few years, a real dissatisfaction and a bit of lack of confidence for Gen Zs in particular in governments and institutions trying to lead. And I think it's important for brands to recognize the responsibility they have to take a stand beyond the transaction of selling products. I think Nike did a good job with Colin Kaepernick back in the day, and that's really important, for a brand to look after, to call it top of funnel, but really that sort of brand values, brand purpose, and not ignore it at the expense of performance marketing, which becomes a very transactional and very short-lived relationship with the consumer. And I think, consumers are much more discerning than they ever were, and they want to buy something that not only makes them feel good, but that is doing good in the world. So I think that's important too.
Well, thank you so much.